Hello and welcome to Soulspeak. He moved through the night like a ghost, and by dawn, families were gone. Night in rural northern China holds a particular kind of stillness. Single bulbs flicker behind wooden shutters. Dogs bark at nothing, then fall silent. Fields stretch for miles without streetlights, and the steady hum of insects fills the air. In that silence, one man found cover. Between 2000 and 2003, he moved unseen through 4 Chinese provinces, Henan, Anhui, and Shanding, carrying with him only simple farm tools and a cold precision that would make him one of the most prolific killers in modern Chinese history. That his name was Yang Shi. To the police, he became known as the Monster Killer. To those who lived through his crimes, he was simply a shadow, faceless, wordless, and unstoppable. He was a drifter who left no note, no warning, and no mercy. By the time his rampage ended, 67 men, women, and children had been brutally murdered. Dozens more had been assaulted. Some entire families were wiped out in a single night. Asterisk for many outside of China, the name Yang Xinhai barely registers. Unlike serial killers whose cases dominated Western media, Yang's story remained mostly confined within China's borders. At the time, China's media operated under far stricter controls than in the West. Graphic details of violent crime were rarely publicized, and officials avoided language that could create panic or tarnish the image of rural stability. News of the killings did appear in domestic reports, but always briefly, a paragraph here, a few lines there. There were no televised manhunts, no in-depth documentaries, no international coverage until years later. For a crime of such magnitude, the world heard almost nothing. That silence wasn't just censorship, it was also circumstance. China, in the early 2000s, was a country in transition. The economic reforms of the 1980s and 1990s had transformed cities like Beijing and Shanghai into modern skylines of progress. But rural regions lagged behind. In those quiet farming provinces, local police departments often operated with limited resources, outdated equipment, and almost no coordination across borders. Yang understood that. He grew up in Henan, a poor landlocked province, and he knew the terrain intimately. He knew which villages were isolated, which roads were dark, and how slowly news traveled from one township to another. He exploited that weakness with ruthless efficiency. Each attack followed a similar pattern. Late at night, Yang would choose a home on the outskirts of a village, one that stood apart from its neighbors. He entered quietly, armed with a hammer, an axe, or whatever tool he could find nearby. Inside, he killed quickly, often striking entire families as they slept. When he left, there was almost no trace of him. No fingerprints, no vehicle, just silence and death. The next morning, the village would awaken to horror. Bodies found in beds, bloodstains on walls, doors left ajar. People whispered that a spirit had done it, because no human could be that cold. At first, the crimes seemed unrelated. The killings in Henan looked different from those in Shanghai. The police in one province didn't talk to those in another. There was no centralized criminal database to connect the dots. But slowly, as the pattern grew, the horror became undeniable. The same style of entry, the same weapons, the same senseless brutality. The story of Yang Xinhai is not just about one man's violence. It is about the cracks in a rapidly changing nation. During China's economic rise, millions left the countryside for factory jobs in the cities. Villages became half empty, police forces overstretched, and surveillance minimal. The government focused on growth and urban progress, while rural areas remained vulnerable, unseen, and often forgotten. Criminologists later called these regions the gray zones, places where traditional community ties had weakened but modern infrastructure had yet to arrive. It was in these gray zones that Yang found freedom to move, to hide, and to kill. For law enforcement, his crimes exposed the urgent need for cross-provincial coordination and forensic modernization. For sociologists, they revealed how neglect and poverty can breed both victims and predators. And for the Chinese public, the case shattered the illusion that violent crime was only a problem of the past or of the city. This video aims to tell the full account, not to sensationalize, but to understand. To understand how one man used geography, poverty, and anonymity to his advantage. To understand why such a large-scale pattern of murder could persist for years before the police realized the same man was behind it all. And to understand what this case reveals about a society in transition, a society caught between tradition and modernity, progress and neglect. Over the next chapters, we'll explore who Yang Xinhai was, how he planned his crimes, how investigators finally caught him, and what his story says about the world that created him. This is not just the story of a killer, It's the story of what happens when silence, distance, and darkness converge. It began in the quiet fields of China's heartland, and for 3 years, the shadow never stopped moving. Yang Xinhai was born in 1968 in Gangyan County, a small farming community in Henan Province, central China. The land there is flat and dusty, marked by fields of corn and wheat, and by the unrelenting rhythm of rural life. His parents were farmers, ordinary, uneducated people who worked long hours just to provide food for their children. Poverty was constant. The family lived in a simple brick house, with no electricity for much of Yang's childhood and little more than what they could grow or trade. It was the kind of environment that demanded endurance more than ambition, and for most children born there, life followed a predictable path: school until adolescence, then labor in the fields or a factory. From a young age, Yang stood apart from his peers. Teachers later described him as quiet, watchful, and unexpectedly intelligent. He learned quickly but rarely spoke in class. He seemed to observe rather than participate, a child who watched people from the edges of a crowd. He had no known record of early aggression, but neither did he form close friendships. When other boys played outside or joined in village festivals, Yang preferred solitude. This isolation wasn't dramatic, it was simply how he existed. He seemed disconnected, as though the world around him was something to be studied, not shared. By the time he reached his mid-teens, Yang's education came to an end. At 17, he dropped out of school, citing financial hardship and the need to work. In truth, schooling in rural Henan offered little incentive. Classrooms were overcrowded, and teachers were poorly paid. For a boy from a poor family, the prospect of finishing school only to remain unemployed felt meaningless. Instead, Yang joined the growing wave of migrant laborers leaving their hometowns in search of work. That decision would shape the rest of his life. The 1980s and early 1990s were years of massive change in China. The country was modernizing rapidly, cities were expanding, and millions of rural workers traveled across provinces to construction sites, coal mines, and factories. Yang was one of them. He moved constantly, sometimes working in Henan, other times in Antwi or He lived in temporary dormitories, ate cheap meals in roadside canteens, and sent whatever little money he earned back home. In these years, his life became rootless. He belonged nowhere, knew no one, and carried his entire world in a single bag. People who met him during these travels described a man who was quiet but unpredictable. He could be helpful one moment and withdrawn the next. He didn't drink heavily, but when angered he could turn cold, even hostile. He had no friends to speak of, no sense of belonging to any community. As a result, rejection came easily to him, sometimes real, sometimes imagined. The long years of transient labor and loneliness hardened him, feeding a sense of resentment toward others who seemed to have family, stability, or social acceptance. Yang's first recorded crimes came in the early 1990s. He was arrested several times for theft, petty burglary, and later for assault. Each conviction deepened his separation from ordinary society. Prison life in China during that period was harsh, overcrowded, violent, and ruled by hierarchy. For someone already distrustful of others, it reinforced the idea that the world was hostile and that survival depended on detachment. When Yang was finally released, he returned to the only life he knew, drifting from place to place, taking odd jobs when he could find them. At some point after his release, Yang began a relationship with a woman from his hometown. For a brief period, it seemed like stability might be possible. But when she discovered his criminal record, she left him. That rejection struck deeply. In his later statements to police, Yang admitted that after his girlfriend's departure, something in him changed permanently. He began to see himself as beyond redemption, a man excluded from the normal order of life. From that moment, his anger wasn't directed at one person but at society itself. He began to believe that everyone else lived better, that they had what he never could: love, family, belonging. Psychologists would later interpret this as a turning point. It marked the transition from an isolated, embittered man to someone capable of depersonalized violence. The internal logic was simple but devastating. If the world would not accept him, then the world did not deserve peace. The very things he was denied, domestic happiness, stability, affection, became the targets of his hatred. His later choice of victims, families sleeping together in their homes, reflected that twisted symbolism. That's important, though, to separate explanation from justification. Poverty and rejection alone do not create murderers. Millions share similar hardships and never commit violence. But in Yang's case, these factors combined with a specific psychological makeup, detachment, lack of empathy, and a capacity for patient observation. His intelligence allowed him to plan. His isolation allowed him to act without guilt. Over time, these traits evolved into something darker, predatory calm that defined his later crimes. By the late 1990s, Yang had become a man without roots, friends, or moral anchor. He was no longer merely poor or lonely. He was estranged from the very concept of community. He trusted no one, worked sporadically, and spent most nights alone. That alienation provided both motive and method. He understood the countryside better than most, its layout, its silences, its vulnerabilities. The same knowledge that could have kept him alive as a laborer would soon make him one of China's most elusive killers. The story of Yang's early life is not the story of a monster suddenly born. It is the slow construction of one. Each disappointment, each humiliation, and each act of rejection added another layer to the shell that would later allow him to take human life without hesitation. The seeds were planted long before the murders began, and when the killing finally started, it would be the inevitable outcome of years of isolation, anger, and decay, one man's private war against a world he believed had already abandoned him. Yang's descent into serious crime did not begin with murder. The record shows a sequence of escalating offenses that, read together, trace a familiar arc: property crime, sexual violence, and then homicidal escalation. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, he was detained for theft, documented arrests in 1988, and again in 1991, offenses that carried short sentences and tethered him briefly to China's penal system. Those early convictions marked him in his community and on police registers. They also interrupted any normal trajectory that might have connected him to steady work, family formation, or civic life. The next, more consequential turning point came in 1996, when Yang was convicted of sexual assault. The court record from that period reports a 5-year sentence. Prison in China at that time was a harsh crucible: overcrowded cells, rigid hierarchies, and a punitive culture that emphasized control rather than rehabilitation. For someone already socially isolated, incarceration often deepened resentments rather than corrected behavior. When Yang was released in 2000, he re-entered a world that had hardened around him. The stigma of a sexual offense conviction carried social penalties, employers were wary, neighbors distrusted him, and opportunities for reintegration were scarce. That social exclusion mattered. Instead of reintegrating, Yang resumed a transient pattern of living. He drifted from province to province, taking temporary labor jobs when he could find them, but rarely establishing roots. Reports describe him as working odd jobs, sleeping in makeshift lodging, and keeping to himself. In practical terms, this lifestyle reduced the social checks that often limit criminal escalation. Without stable relationships or responsibilities, his actions faced fewer informal constraints. The absence of family anchors and the limited likelihood of local support made it easier to live a life characterized by secrecy and mobility. The psychological consequences of this trajectory are important to trace, but they should be stated carefully. Isolation, stigma, and repeated contact with the criminal justice system do not mechanistically produce killers. Rather, they create conditions in which pre-existing tendencies can grow unchecked. For Yang, the progression from theft to sexual violence to increasingly brutal attacks shows an erosion of inhibitions, where theft takes property and sexual assault asserts control over an individual. Murder fully removes the personhood of the victim. Each step indicates a widening moral gap. He moved from taking what was not his to taking people's bodies and lives. After his release in 2000, there is evidence that Yang began testing boundaries. The first post-release incidents show a shift in both target and method. Instead of stealing goods, he began entering homes at night, initially to see whether houses were occupied and vulnerable. Later, to act on opportunity. The shift was practical. Nighttime entries reduced the chance of resistance. Rural homes often lacked locks or had doors left open. Neighbors lived far apart. He moved through the countryside with the knowledge of a laborer familiar with village layouts, knowing which houses stood alone, which roads were seldom traveled, and when families would likely be asleep. What may have started as opportunistic burglaries quickly took on a darker character. This phase also reveals a tactical learning curve. Yang's choice of blunt agricultural tools, hammers, shovels, axes, was pragmatic. These were items readily available in rural households and easy to carry without drawing attention. The use of such implements also left a particular forensic footprint: blunt force trauma, chaotic blood patterns, and fewer ballistic or traceable residues than firearms or knives might produce. In other words, His methods both exploited the physical environment and complicated early forensic linkage between scenes. At first, local police tended to treat each incident as an isolated burglary or violent home invasion. The absence of centralized case comparison and the limited forensics of small stations meant that the pattern went unrecognized for a time. Equally significant is the emotional tone that accompanied these acts. Witness statements and later interrogations suggest Yang operated with increasing emotional detachment, where early crimes can sometimes be traced to desperation or transient need. His post-release offenses displayed a cold pragmatism: choose vulnerable targets, act quickly, and leave before discovery. That effective flattening lack of visible remorse, absence of expressed motive beyond practical ends aligns with profiles of offenders who escalate from property crime to violent predation. He was not responding to a single grievance. He was engaging in repeated predatory acts that normalized violence for him. The criminological concept of escalation is helpful here. Many violent offenders move along a kind of gradient: initial illegal acts that test boundaries, theft, then acts that exert power over another, sexual assault, and finally acts that demonstrate ultimate control, murder. With Yang, each stage erased another break on behavior. Prison experience, social exclusion, and mobility provided context. His choices provided method. The result was a pattern that increasingly targeted sleeping households, where resistance was minimal and the symbolic effect destroying family units was maximal. Finally, it is worth noting how institutional limitations shaped this phase. In the years immediately after his release, police resources in rural China were uneven. Many local stations lacked systematic case-sharing mechanisms with neighboring counties or provinces. That fragmentation allowed Yang's pattern to extend across administrative borders before investigators could connect the dots. The combination of his tactical learning, geographic mobility, emotional detachment, and institutional blind spots created the conditions for his crimes to intensify, from theft to the widespread, repeated homicides that would later define his name. The sequence that would come to define Yang's criminal career began in earnest in 2000. What started as isolated violent breaks incidents that local police at first treated as individual home invasions or robberies. On a pattern as similar elements recurred across county lines. The attacks appeared first in Henan province and, over the next 3 years, turned up in Hebei, Anhui. The geographic spread was not random. Each location shared the features Yang preferred: sparsely populated farmland, scattered homesteads, and limited nighttime surveillance. In these places, a single intruder could approach a house without being seen and leave before a neighbor noticed anything amiss. Yang's operational choices were practical and adapted to the rural environment. He struck principally at night, choosing moments when occupants were asleep and the likelihood of resistance was minimal. He favored detached houses and farmsteads rather than tightly packed village homes. Those physical choices lowered the chance of interruption and raised the likelihood that an entire household would be vulnerable at the same time. By moving between provinces and striking in communities that were not closely networked, he reduced the odds that separate police stations would notice a reciprocal pattern early on. The tools of his crimes were ordinary agricultural implements: hammers, shovels, axes. These were both opportunistic and strategic choices. Tools common on farms were easy to carry without attracting attention. They could be obtained locally and left little in the way of ballistic residue or distinctive trace evidence. Blunt force attacks produce chaotic wound patterns and, in a pre-DNA, low forensics environment, offered plausible explanations at first as isolated acts of domestic violence or burglary gone wrong. The use of such implements also suggests a willingness to employ raw force rather than attempting to conceal or elaborate a crime scene, reinforcing the brutal, efficient character of the assaults. There was no consistent victim type in the usual demographic sense. Yang attacked men and women, elderly people and children, entire families sleeping under the same roof. That indiscriminate selection increased the horror of the crimes and complicated profiling efforts. The fact that some attacks involved subsequent sexual assault of surviving female victims added another dimension. The offenses were not simply instrumental thefts, but also acts of sexualized violence and domination. Together, the combination of indiscriminate killing and sexual assault suggested a perpetrator whose motives were not limited to material gain but included ritualized expressions of power and control. Tactical patterns emerged once investigators began to compare scenes. Entries were often through simple doors or unlatched windows. Attacks were concentrated during late night or early morning hours. Bodies were typically found in beds or on sleeping mats, indicating that the assailant struck while victims were least able to defend themselves. There was almost always a rapid departure after the attack. Witnesses rarely reported seeing anyone leave or driving away. That single feature, no vehicle, no long traces, later made investigators believe the offender often traveled by bicycle or on foot, blending into the rural landscape between attacks. Several incidents exemplify the scale and brutality. In Anhui Province in 2001, a single household of 5 was discovered, slaughtered in their sleep. The scene suggested a swift, merciless assault in which no occupant could respond. In Shandong in 2002, investigators uncovered a family of 4 reduced to death in their home, 2 of whom were children. Those particular cases crystallized public fear. The killer did not spare the most vulnerable, and entire family units could be destroyed in a single night. Local communities responded with heightened anxiety. Houses were bolted. Watchers were organized, and yet the killer continued to find gaps he could exploit. Mobility was central to Yang's ability to avoid early detection. He seldom remained in one area for long. Reports and later interrogations indicate he traveled alone, often by bicycle, which was an unremarkable mode of travel in rural China, but one that made cross-county movement inconspicuous. Without a consistent local presence, he left no steady pattern of association for police to pick up. Suspects who stayed within a community would more likely be seen and reported. Yang's transient existence blurred jurisdictional lines. County police documented individual cases without immediate cross-referencing to neighboring districts, and that fragmentation bought him time and space to continue. The accumulating toll became impossible to ignore. When police eventually consolidated multiple investigations, the official count reached dozens of homicides and a significant number of sexual assaults. By the time the pattern was fully recognized and connected across provinces, authorities attributed 67 murders and roughly 23 sexual assaults to the same perpetrator. Those figures are not merely statistics. They indicate repeated access to homes and repeated success in evading early capture, circumstances that speak both to his methods and to institutional vulnerabilities. Analyzing the pattern reveals a trajectory of increasing emotional distance and operational refinement. Early acts, as described by investigators, sometimes bore signs of opportunism. Over time, the crimes show a hardening, fewer signs of hesitation, more decisive attacks, and a steadier selection of isolated homes. The repeated targeting of sleeping families indicates not only tactical efficiency but also a symbolic element, the annihilation of domestic stability. The killer's actions embodied a severe violation, not random public violence but the destruction of the private, intimate sphere of ordinary life. For investigators, the repetition across time and space provided the key to linking cases. Forensic similarities, weapon types, entry patterns, and victimology combined to form a behavioral signature, but the signature was slow to emerge in a system that lacked rapid, centralized information sharing. Small police stations rarely coordinated their crime records with neighboring jurisdictions, and forensic technology was unevenly available in rural areas. That delay allowed Yang's pattern to deepen before law enforcement developed a coherent, multi-province investigative response. Finally, the killing spree left a profound social imprint. Villages that had once been quietly governed by daily routines were transformed by fear and suspicion. The psychological consequences for survivors and neighboring communities were long-term. People slept less easily, children were kept closer to home, and the sense of safety that underpinned rural life was fractured. The pragmatic choices Yang made targeting isolated homes, using common tools, traveling anonymously had outsized effects not only on individual victims but on the social fabric of entire regions. In sum, the 2002-2003 period was not a series of random crimes. It was a sustained, adaptive campaign of predation across rural China. Its lessons are twofold: the tactical profile of the offender, methodical, mobile, indifferent to victim type, and the institutional failures that allowed such a campaign to continue. Understanding both dimensions is crucial to appreciating how one man could convert the hush of rural nights into years of terror. Yang's crimes carried a behavioral imprint that investigators call a signature, a set of repeated choices that went beyond opportunism and revealed something about how he understood his acts. The most obvious element of that signature was timing. He struck at night, almost always when households were asleep. Attacking sleeping victims reduced the chance of resistance and guaranteed total control of the scene. From a tactical perspective, the choice was efficient. From a psychological perspective, it was meaningful. Hitting people in the most vulnerable state, curled in bed, dependent on the protections of family and home, suggests a desire not merely to kill but to dominate, and to remove any agency from his victims. Closely tied to timing was method. Yang favored blunt, agricultural implements, hammers, shovels, axes rather than knives or firearms. Those tools were plentiful in rural homes and carried symbolic weight. They were instruments of everyday labor. Repurposed as instruments of death, the transformation of a common implement into a weapon compresses two messages. First, that violence was integrated into the ordinary environment he inhabited. Second, that the act itself was rooted in the material world of rural labor. Using such tools also had practical advantages. They were unremarkable to carry, left a messy but non-technical forensic signature, and could be sourced locally, avoiding the need for premeditated procurement. Over repeated incidents, the consistency of weapon type helped create a behavioral thread linking scenes across provinces. Another revealing feature of Yang's pattern was victim grouping. He did not single out individuals randomly. He often attacked entire households. Family units, parents, children, grandparents would be found together, all struck down in the same night. This repeated destruction of domestic units points to a symbolic dimension in his crimes. Destroying a family is a maximal expression of control. It ends relationships, erases shared histories, and leaves a community destabilized. The pattern suggests that the offense satisfied compulsions beyond personal grievance or material need. Eradicating family life served as the ultimate assertion of dominance over the social bonds he lacked and resented. Psychologically, these elements align with common themes in the study of serial offenders: control, depersonalization, and escalation. Many offenders who commit repeated, premeditated homicides do so to reassert power they feel denied in ordinary life. For Yang, whose biography showed long-term marginality and repeated social rejection, the acts can be read as attempts to reverse that marginality by imposing absolute power over others' fates. The night attacks, blunt force methods, and family targeting combine into a behavioral syndrome, characterized by effective blunting, reduced empathy, and a mechanical approach to killing, and by violence recurrent choices that satisfy an internal logic for the offender. Equally important is the distinction between modus operandi (MO) and signature. The MO describes practical, changeable behaviors, how the offender gains entry, what tool is used, how he flees. A signature concerns psychological needs and remains stable because it gratifies the offender's inner drives. In Yang's case, the MO adapted to local conditions, using different points of entry, sometimes concealing tracks, sometimes carrying tools from scene to scene. The signature nighttime attacks on sleeping families with blunt tools remained constant. That constancy allowed investigators to link otherwise separated cases. Once data sharing and cross-jurisdictional comparisons improved, comparing Yang to American offenders clarifies both universal patterns and cultural differences. Consider Dennis Rader, BTK. Rader also demonstrated a methodical pattern, planning, selecting victims, and returning to the scene in ways that satisfied his psychological needs for control and attention. Rader's crimes included a ritualistic element, taunting communications, and post-offense staging. Yang displayed ritual in a different register: no taunting, no letters to police, but a steady, symbolic destruction of domestic life. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, shared with Yang the preference for nocturnal predation and arbitrary victim selection. Ramirez combined theft, sexual assault, and murder, often committed with brutal intimacy. Both American cases and Yang's show how nocturnal predation enables offenders to exploit privacy and reduce resistance. Yet the cultural and institutional contexts shaped visibility. Ramirez's crimes in Los Angeles drew intense media attention and aggressive multi-agency policing. Yang's crimes unfolded largely in quiet rural districts with limited insurgency coordination. Delaying pattern recognition. American serial cases often involve publicity that changes offender behavior, either by escalating for notoriety or by modifying methods to avoid detection. Yang, by contrast, operated in regions where public dissemination of details was constrained and where rural isolation limited sensational spread. That relative invisibility likely reduced any feedback loop between media coverage and criminal adaptation. Instead, Yang's behavioral choices appear rooted primarily in personal compulsion and opportunism rather than a calculated response to public attention. Finally, the pattern yields operational lessons. A recurring signature focused investigators' resources, forensic labs could compare wound patterns and blunt force trauma. Behavioral analysts could create profiles to narrow suspect pools. Interprovincial coordination could map mobility and predict potential next targets. Recognizing signature elements, styming, weapon type, victim grouping turned a scattering of horrific incidents into a coherent investigative narrative. It was the intersection of these psychological and procedural insights that ultimately allowed law enforcement to move from reactive local responses to a coordinated, evidence-based pursuit. In sum, Yang's pattern combined pragmatic choices with symbolic acts. He exploited the night and the rural landscape. He used ordinary tools to inflict extraordinary harm, and he targeted family structures in ways that suggest a deeper psychological aim to exert absolute control where he had felt none. That blend of utility and compulsion defines his signature and explains both why his crimes were so difficult to detect early and why, once linked, they revealed a clear and chilling logic. The end of Yang Xinhai's mobility came not through a dramatic stakeout or a civilian tip about a suspicious stranger, but through routine policing. On November 3, 2003, local officers in Gyeongju Bay detained a man during a random identity check. He was traveling without steady papers and matched a rough description circulating in some districts. At face value, the stop was ordinary part of the night patrols that police in rural and semi-rural areas conduct to check itinerant workers and transient residents. What turned that ordinary check into a decisive breakthrough was the practice, newly emphasized in some jurisdictions then, of collecting biological samples for comparison in ongoing investigations. Following his detention, authorities collected a DNA sample as part of standard procedure. Laboratory comparison linked that sample to biological evidence recovered from multiple homicide scenes. Once technicians confirmed a match, investigators had the forensic connection they needed to transform scattered cases into a single, prosecutable chain. The DNA evidence provided the bridge from suspicion to linkage across provincial lines. Scenes that had been treated as isolated tragedies now bore the mark of a single author. For investigators, the match changed everything. It allowed law enforcement to consolidate cases, allocate resources strategically, and build a legal file that reached beyond a single county's jurisdiction. Taken into custody for questioning, Yang did not resist the narrative the evidence created. During interrogation, he made direct, chilling admissions. He acknowledged responsibility for multiple murders and assaults, and his statements reflected a particular emotional flatness. One reported line stood out for its bluntness and lack of remorse. "When I killed people, I felt a desire. I didn't care who they were." That declaration captured both motive and effective tone, an admission that framed the crimes as internally driven acts of compulsion rather than responses to situational grievances. The recorded confession, combined with forensic matches, created a robust prosecutorial case. The legal process that followed moved quickly. The consolidated charges were brought before a provincial court, and Yang was tried at the Luo Intermediate People's Court in Henan. The trial opened in early 2004. Chinese criminal procedure in such clear-cut cases is designed for expediency. Evidence is presented, witnesses may be called, and the court reaches a verdict on a compressed timeline compared to many Western systems. On February 1, 2004, the court found Yang guilty on multiple counts of homicide and sexual assault and sentenced him to death. The conviction cited the DNA linkage, his confessions, and the patterning of crimes as dispositive. Yang's execution followed swiftly by local standards. On February 14, 2004, judicial authorities carried out the death sentence. The date symbolically underscored the speed of legal closure within months of arrest. The state had assembled forensic proof, conducted a trial, and executed the sentence. For officials and the public eager for accountability, the rapid process delivered a clear narrative arc: capture, confession, conviction, and retribution. For victims' families, the finality offered a legal resolution, even as grief and trauma persisted. Public reaction was immediate and intense at the local level. Communities that had lived in fear responded with relief, tempered by lingering trauma. Many residents voiced gratitude for the arrest and satisfaction that the man suspected of destroying households had been stopped. At the same time, there was a collective reckoning with institutional shortcomings. How could such a mobile offender operate for years without earlier detection? Local newspapers and village meetings focused on security improvements and the need to better coordinate law enforcement across county lines. National media presented the case more soberly. State-run outlets reported the facts: arrest, confession, trial. sentence, but did so without the sensationalized detail that Western tabloids often pursue. Coverage tended to emphasize the restoration of social order and the effectiveness of police work. That restrained tone reflected the broader media environment of the time. Officials and editors consciously avoided lurid portrayals of violence that might inflame public sentiment or suggest broader systemic instability. The result was a narrative focused on closure and state efficacy rather than on an extended public debate about causes, rehabilitation, or criminal pathology. Comparing the Chinese handling of the case to how a similar case might unfold in the United States highlights significant procedural and cultural differences. In the US, high-profile serial homicide cases often generate protracted pretrial litigation, extensive media attention, and lengthy appeals. Defense teams in the American system might contest interrogation methods, challenge forensic protocols, or seek psychological evaluations that can delay trial for months or years. Public discourse in the West frequently centers on motives, mental health, and systemic prevention, sometimes at the cost of quick legal closure. By contrast, the Chinese process prioritized swift adjudication and a decisive sentence, with less visible public contestation over forensic or ethical questions. That difference does not imply an absence of debate within China. Rather, it reveals divergent institutional priorities. In the early 2000s, Chinese authorities emphasized social stability and rapid restoration of order. The speed of Yang's trial and execution fit that priority. A prompt, unambiguous resolution that reassured communities and demonstrated the capacity of the state to respond. Critics, especially outside China, might question whether such quick processes allow for exhaustive defense or full forensic scrutiny. But within the domestic framework, they were consistent with broader governance aims. Finally, the capture and legal resolution closed a painful chapter in practical terms, but opened broader questions in institutional and social terms. The DNA match that arrested Yang also underscored the importance of forensic modernization and interjurisdictional data sharing. The confession laid bare psychological dynamics that would interest clinicians and criminologists, even if public discussion of those dynamics remained muted. And the swift trial highlighted tensions between speedy justice and extended adjudicatory safeguards. For investigators and policymakers, the case offered lessons: better cross-regional coordination, expanded forensic capacity in rural stations, and mechanisms to track transient populations more effectively. In short, Yang's arrest in Kangju was the pivot from dark anonymity to forensic exposure. The confession made the motive stark and unsettling. The trial and execution resolved the legal question quickly, reflecting procedural norms and political priorities of the time. Yet the societal questions that the crimes raised about institutional blind spots, rural vulnerability, and the roots of extreme violence persisted, demanding attention long after the courtroom doors closed. Yang's own words during interrogation offer an unvarnished window into motive, a terse admission that killing produced a desire, and that he didn't care who they were. That statement frames the problem plainly. His acts were not driven by a narrowly personal grievance against specific victims, but by an internally generated compulsion, interpreted alongside his life history. Those words point to two interlocking domains of explanation: the personal psychology of the offender, and the social resentments that shaped his worldview. Neither domain fully explains the crimes on its own. Together they map a trajectory from marginalization to predatory violence. At the social level, observers and some investigators have described elements of revenge and contempt in Yang's posture toward ordinary society. His biography records repeated social exclusion, poverty, interrupted education, transient labor, criminal convictions, and the loss of a significant intimate relationship. He reported feeling rejected after his girlfriend left him upon learning of his criminal history. That rupture appears to have hardened an already present sense of alienation. In Yang's later statements, and in the pattern of his targets, one can see a symbolic logic. He attacked ordinary family life, the very form of stability and belonging he believed had been denied him. The killings of entire households carry an almost metaphorical violence, erasing the domestic units that represented the social order and comforts from which he felt excluded. Psychologically, Yang's conduct aligns with clinical features frequently associated with severe antisocial behavior. While a formal post-arrest diagnosis in public records is limited, his behavior, persistent disregard for others' rights, lack of remorse, repeated criminal acts, and superficial charm in some interactions fits the diagnostic picture of antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. SPD is characterized by impulsivity, deceit, and a marked failure to conform to social norms. In extreme cases, it associates with the capacity for calculated predation. Important caveats apply. Diagnosis requires careful clinical evaluation and should not be inferred simplistically from criminality alone. Nevertheless, the pattern of escalating violence, emotional detachment, and repeated offenses supports the view that Yang's inner life was marked by affective, blunting, and impaired empathy, conditions that remove psychological brakes against harming others. Closely tied to this clinical framing is the concept of compulsion, behaviors driven by an internal urge that produces gratification. Yang's crimes displayed a repeated sequence that combined sexual violence, physical slaughter, and theft. That sequence skill rape still suggests a compounding cycle of satisfaction. The murder provided absolute control. The sexual assault enacted domination and humiliation. The theft completed a practical appropriation of victims' goods. For the offender, each element may have served a distinct psychological function: the killing to eliminate resistance and assert dominance, the sexual violence to satisfy erotic aggression and power, and the theft to erase traces while also extracting material gain. Together they composed a ritualized series of acts that likely reinforced future offending by providing multiple sources of reinforcement, sexual and material. Comparisons to well-known American serial offenders clarify parallels and contrasts. Consider Ted Bundy. Superficially different in method, Bundy relied on charm, abduction in public spaces, and a pattern of luring victims, yet similar in the psychological drive for control and in emotional detachment. Bundy's violence was interwoven with manipulation and theatricality. Yang's violence was stripped of spectacle and rooted in stealth and anonymity. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, shares stronger procedural similarities with Yang. Nocturnal attacks, sexual violence intertwined with murder, and an apparent lack of discriminating motive beyond domination. Both Ramirez and Yang preyed on the privacy of homes at night, exploiting the vulnerability of sleeping victims. Cultural and media contexts shaped public perceptions differently. Ramirez's crimes unfolded under intense American media scrutiny, which influenced both public fear and investigative resources, while Yang's occurred largely in rural districts where local constraints and restrained reporting limited immediate national and international visibility. Importantly, the motive question cannot be reduced to either pathology or grievance alone. Forensic psychology frames such cases as multi-pronged. Personal history creates vulnerability, psychological traits create capacity, and situational opportunities create possibility. In Yang's case, the convergence was stark. Social exclusion and personal rejection fed resentment. A personality structure characterized by low empathy and high impulsivity provided capacity, and the rural environment, with its anonymity and low immediate oversight, offered opportunity. That convergence turned latent hostility into repeated lethal action. The moral tone of Yang's confession, detached and almost clinical, also points to a critical feature of his mental life: depersonalization. He did not appear to name or personalize victims. Instead, he described them as objects of an urge. Depersonalization facilitates extreme harm because it severs ordinary human moral response. The victims become obstacles or instruments rather than people with claims to dignity. That state of mind helps explain why entire families could be slaughtered without apparent targeting of any specific individual. Finally, it is worth noting the limits of psychological explanation. Understanding motive helps illuminate why at a broad level, but it does not exculpate the offender, nor does it fully account for the particular choices made in each crime. Social policy lessons follow. Preventing such trajectories requires early social support, rehabilitation efforts that reduce recidivism, and improved monitoring and intervention for offenders showing escalating violence. In Yang's case, his motives emerged from a grim formula of personal grievance, psychological capacity, and environmental opportunity, a formula that, once recognized, offers both explanation and a cautionary account of what can happen when those elements converge. The immediate social effect was a profound and widespread fear. Villages that had earlier regarded violent crime as an urban problem found themselves on edge. People who once trusted the night to pass without consequence began to bolt doors, sleep in shifts, and keep children close. That change in daily life, simple practices like keeping lanterns lit or neighbors organizing night watches, became an index of communal trauma. The killings punctured a basic assumption of rural life, that home is safe. Where that assumption failed, social routines adjusted quickly and tensely. officials responded with visible security measures aimed at restoring that sense of safety. Local governments ordered increased patrols, installed checkpoints on minor roads, and promoted neighborhood watch schemes. In many counties, police presence moved from episodic to steady, more night patrols, more identity checks, and a renewed emphasis on monitoring transient populations. These actions were pragmatic. Policymakers needed to reassure frightened communities and show that the state could reassert control over the countryside. At a structural level, the investigation into the killings accelerated an institutional shift toward modern forensic capacity. Chinese law enforcement agencies invested in DNA testing and in mechanisms for cross-jurisdictional data comparison. The early 2000s saw the expansion of forensic databases and a push to standardize how biological evidence was collected and shared between provinces. That investment was directly tied to lessons learned from the case. A mobile offender exploiting gaps between counties made clear the need for centralized tools that could connect evidence across administrative boundaries. Media coverage of the crimes was restrained by design. State and local outlets reported arrests and convictions, but avoided prolonged, lurid exposition. Editors and officials were mindful of public order. Sensational headlines that might inflame fear or encourage copycat behavior were consciously limited. For international observers accustomed to sprawling media investigations and sensational trial coverage, the relative terseness of domestic reports was notable. Within China, that restraint shaped public understanding. Many people learned key facts through short, factual dispatches rather than through extended investigative narratives. Public debate, when it occurred, focused on moral and policy questions. Families of victims and their neighbors demanded stronger enforcement and harsher penalties. Some voices called for systemic reform, better rural policing, improved social services, and more effective re-entry programs for released offenders. Others framed the issue in moral terms: how to balance retribution with legal fairness, and whether the criminal justice system should concentrate on punishment or prevention. The swift trial and execution that followed arrests satisfied many who wanted closure, but it also generated quieter, more complex conversations among scholars, legal professionals, and human rights advocates about due process and the scope of state power. Beyond immediate reforms, the case had longer-term implications for rural governance and social policy. It highlighted the vulnerabilities created by rapid urbanization. As young people left villages for work, oversight and community cohesion weakened. Administrators began to consider how migration, unemployment, and social marginalization might indirectly increase local vulnerability to crime. In some provinces, that awareness produced modest investments in local policing, social welfare, and public education campaigns about security practices. Psychologically, the imprint endured. Survivors and neighbors carried the memory of those nights for years. Altered sleeping habits, heightened suspicion of strangers, and a background awareness that anonymity can conceal danger. At the societal level, the killings became a reference point in discussions about modernizations and even effects. A case where economic progress and social transformation left seams that could be exploited by a violent individual. In short, the killings prompted immediate security responses, accelerated forensic modernization, constrained media narratives, and provoked debates about punishment, prevention, and social responsibility. The practical reforms: more patrols, better DNA work, improved interjurisdictional communication, addressed tactical gaps revealed by the crimes. The deeper, more enduring consequence was a national recognition that rapid change brings new vulnerabilities, and that protecting the most isolated communities requires both policing and social investment. The Yang Xinhai case gains clarity when set beside high-profile American serial killer cases. In the United States, many notorious offenders operated within densely networked social environments, neighborhoods, campuses, or urban nightlife where victims often had complex social ties. That context produced different investigative signatures, witnesses, CCTV, multiple points of contact, and a higher likelihood that someone in the victim's circle would notice suspicious behavior. By contrast, Yang preyed on isolated rural households. His targets were often families living on the edges of villages, where neighbors were far apart, nightly surveillance was minimal, and simple household routines opened doors. Unlit yards created exploitable vulnerabilities. The difference is not merely geographic, it is structural. Rural anonymity and low civic density reduced the informal social controls that, in other settings, frequently deter or expose. offenders. Legal and procedural contrasts follow naturally from that divergence in setting. High-profile serial cases in the US tend to generate prolonged pretrial activity, grand juries, discovery fights, expert testimony, lengthy motions, and an often years-long appeals process. Media scrutiny is intense and can shape public perception, investigative priorities, and prosecutorial strategy. China's response to Yang, by institutional contrast, moved quickly. Arrest, forensic linkage, trial, and execution happened within months. That speed reflected procedural norms and political priorities, rapid restoration of public order, and a closed adjudicative arc rather than the protracted adversarial process familiar in American courts. Each model carries trade-offs. The American emphasis on procedural safeguards and public contestation can delay closure, while the Chinese emphasis on expedition can limit public debate about causes, rehabilitation, or systemic shortcomings. Those differences highlight practical lessons for law enforcement and policymakers everywhere. First and foremost is the technical need for cross-jurisdictional data sharing. Yang's mobility across provinces exploited administrative seams. The absence of centralized, interoperable forensic and case management systems delayed pattern recognition. The remedy is straightforward in principle. Build and maintain databases that allow rapid comparison of DNA, wound patterns, and modus operandi across counties and regions. The US experience with national databases shows how connectivity shortens the window in which a mobile offender can operate. The Yang case demonstrates the cost when that connectivity is insufficient. Second is the early identification of criminal escalation. Yang's trajectory from theft to sexual assault to murder mirrors escalation patterns documented in criminology. Prison releases, repeated nonviolent offenses, and social marginalization are risk markers that require structured post-release supervision and targeted interventions. Effective systems combine monitoring with rehabilitation, addiction or mental health treatment, job placement, and community reintegration programs that reduce the social isolation which can permit recidivism to intensify. Third is the simple but often overlooked reality of rural vulnerability. Policies that concentrate forensic and policing resources in urban centers risk leaving the countryside exposed. Practical responses include strengthening local stations with basic forensic kits, training in evidence preservation, and routine protocols for sharing case data with regional centers. Community-level measures public education about secure locks, neighborhood watch programs adapted to local conditions, and improved lighting also reduce the low-effort opportunities offenders exploit. Beyond technical fixes, the case underscores an important normative lesson. Preventive policies must bridge social and institutional work. Law enforcement improvements, databases, patrols, forensic labs are necessary but not sufficient. Addressing the social drivers that can produce violent escalation requires investments in education, employment, mental health services, and re-entry programs. Where modernization leaves rural communities behind, it creates both victims and environments in which predators can hide. Finally, cross-cultural reflection matters. Comparing Yang to American offenders clarifies that, while psychological drives depersonalization, escalation can be universal. The environment and institutional responses shape how quickly crimes are noticed and how they are prosecuted. The takeaway for policymakers and investigators is practical. Reduce seams, share information, and treat rural safety as integral to national security. For communities, the takeaway is equally direct. Vigilance, simple safeguards, and social support systems can make the difference between a single isolated crime and a prolonged campaign of predation. By the time investigators closed the file, the human toll was stark and simple. 67 lives ended, dozens more traumatized. Those numbers compress a larger story into a single, terrible fact. A solitary man, moving across provinces, turned private grievances and social isolation into mass violence. Yang Xinhai's trajectory from marginal laborer to prolific killer underscores a grim truth. Extreme criminality often grows where personal pathology meets opportunity and institutional blind spots. This case draws a hard line between circumstance and choice without collapsing the two. Poverty, disrupted education, social stigma, and the brutalizing effects of incarceration did not excuse his actions. They help explain how a man with the capacity for observation and planning could find both motive and means. The rural landscape he exploited, scattered homes, minimal night surveillance, and fragmented policing was as much a part of the story as his own internal drives. For victims and their families, The distinction is academic. What mattered was that ordinary domestic life was violated again and again. The broader lesson moves beyond attribution and into prevention, where social safety nets are weak and information does not flow across jurisdictions. Violent patterns may persist longer than they should. Technical fixes, DNA databases, improved forensic training, interregional case sharing are essential. Equally important are social measures that reduce the conditions for escalation, meaningful post-release support, employment opportunities, and community reintegration programs that make reoffending harder and recovery more plausible. There is also a moral point embedded in the public record. The destruction of family units was not random collateral damage, but a recurring element of Yang's crimes. That repetition suggests a psychological architecture centered on domination and depersonalization. Recognizing those patterns matters for investigators, clinicians, and policymakers because it shapes both prevention strategies and how societies respond when the worst happens. Monsters aren't born, they're made when society stops caring. That line is not an excuse. It is a warning. It asks whether communities, institutions, and systems are attentive enough to spot danger early and whether responses are calibrated to protect the vulnerable. The Yang case shows the cost when the answer is no. Did one isolated man become a monster by nature, or did a sequence of social failures shape him into one? The evidence points to a painful mixture of both. We may never know the full interior life that drove his cruelty, but we can act on what is clear: better detection, better coordination, and a firmer commitment to the social conditions that reduce violence. If this episode raised questions for you, leave a comment below. Tell us, do you see Yang Xinhai as born evil or made by his circumstances? Like the video if you found the analysis helpful, and subscribe to SoulSpeak for more careful examinations of true crime cases and the lessons they teach. Thank you for staying with us through this difficult but important story. These cases aren't easy to hear, but understanding them helps us see the patterns that shape violence and, more importantly, how we can prevent it. Your time and attention mean a lot. If this episode made you think, share your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And if you'd like to keep exploring the darker corners of human psychology with us, please like this video, subscribe to SoulSpeak, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.